Okay, last time I spent a lot of time on the ASH impression formation paradigm, and I did that for a couple of reasons. First, that's where the study of social cognition begins, historically. Second, that's where the study of social cognition begins conceptually, with perception. And third, the methods that ASH used in the impression formation experiment have been enormously influential, and you'll see variations on the basic impression formation paradigm over and over and over again as you do your own independent reading in this area. And just as a reminder, ASH got a number of different interesting effects, but the two that we're going to focus on here, the big two for ASH, was first that there was an order effect in impression formation. The first information that we receive about a person is inordinately influential in forming the final impression that we have about that person. And Ash argued, as a good Gestalt psychologist would, that somehow the first thing you learn about an individual creates a kind of filter that shapes and modulates everything else that you learn. Now, somebody, I can't remember who it was, raised a very interesting question last time about whether this was just a memory effect, whether the order effect in impression formation was somehow a product of the so-called primacy effect in memory. Those of you who've had a course in memory or probably introductory psychology know that in memory there are these two big effects: primacy effect, where the first information that the person studies tends to be remembered better than information in the middle of a list, and a recency effect, where the material from the end of a list tends to be remembered better than the information from the middle of the list. And it's possible that the order effect that Ash got was just a primacy effect. You got more time to rehearse it or whatever, but I don't think so. And Ash certainly wouldn't have thought so, but I don't think so either. And the reason I don't think so is that Ash's lists were really short. You notice that his trait ensembles consisted only of 6 or 7 items. And that's well within the span of short-term or working memory for most people. And these primacy and recency effects, especially the primacy effect, seems to reflect the operation of long-term memory. So Ash would have thought that this was really a perceptual effect, not a memory effect, though I think, you can still do some research on this. The second finding, the one I want to focus on today, was the finding that some traits were central to an impression and others were more peripheral. By this, Ash meant that there are some traits like warm, cold, intelligent, unintelligent, that made an enormous difference to the person's final impression, to the perceiver's final impression of a person, depending on whether they were present or not. And there were other traits like polite, blunt, that just didn't make that much difference. So there are some traits that are central to impression formation and others that are more peripheral. What I want to focus on today is the question of what makes a trait central. Ash didn't know. He raised this question, but he didn't have a clear idea himself about what it was about warm versus cold or intelligent versus unintelligent, as opposed to polite versus blunt, that made traits central. And he didn't take the time, probably a good thing, because it's a lifetime's worth of work, to go through every imaginable trait polarity in the lexicon and try to figure out which ones really affected the final impressions more than the other. He just noted, as a kind of serendipitous empirical finding, he didn't think this was going to happen, that some traits were more important, had a greater impact on impressions than other traits did. The first guy to address this is actually a close friend of Ash's named Julius Wishner, who did a very interesting experiment. Again, you see a lot of experiments like this in the literature, in which he created a list of 50 or so bipolar adjectives like polite, blunt, warm, cold, intelligent, unintelligent, including all the items that Ash had used in his own impression formation experiments, and gave them to a bunch of students, they were college students, and asked them simply to pick an acquaintance, your roommate, your boyfriend, your uncle, somebody you know, and rate that individual on each of these scales. Then what Wishner did was to examine the correlations between each of the 53 trait scales and each of the remaining 52 trait scales. So he had this massive correlation matrix, 53 traits by 53 traits, which is, you can do the multiplication. It's a lot of correlations, okay? It's 53 times 52. And then simply looked at the correlations that he had. Now you got to note when this was done. This is 1960. This is before the advent of high-speed computers in social science research. Frankly, this was before the advent of low-speed computers in social science research. When I got my first job at Harvard University in 1975, the mainframe at Harvard had less computational power than your wristwatch. It was unbelievable, okay? So what Wishner didn't have the kinds of computational power accessible to him that we would have today. He did all of this by hand and all of this by eyeball. And what he did was to examine the pattern of correlations among traits. And what he discovered was that traits that Ash had identified as central traits, traits like intelligent versus unintelligent, warm versus cold, tended to have relatively high correlations with the other traits in the matrix. Now remember what a correlation coefficient is. A correlation coefficient is a statistic that measures the direction and strength of the association between two variables. What that means is that for traits like warm and cold, warm versus cold, or intelligent versus unintelligent, they have a relatively strong degree of association between them and other traits in the matrix. Whereas for peripheral traits, and here the example trait is dichotomy is polite versus blunt, the correlations were substantially lower. So central traits have higher correlations with other traits. Peripheral traits have lower correlations with other traits, leading Wishner to conclude that what makes a trait central is that it carries more information. If a trait like warm or cold is positively correlated with lots of other traits, then if I tell you that somebody is warm or cold, you already know a whole bunch of other things about that person without me having to say it, because you can rely on the correlation between this trait and other kinds of traits to provide more information than simply that. But if I tell you that somebody's polite or blunt, the correlations between polite and blunt and other traits tend to be relatively low, so these peripheral traits provide relatively less information. Yeah?
Has it been looked into whether these central traits are culturally dependent? For example, in Japan, where especially elders get important, perhaps polite and blunt may be a more central trait?
It has not been done, to my knowledge. That would be a really interesting thing to do. But this lecture is devoted to something called implicit personality theory, okay, which is a term I'm going to come to in a minute. You're ahead of me, as usual. You guys are ahead of me. This is very good. And implicit personality theory refers to people's kind of intuitive views of what personality is like. I'll expand on that in a couple of minutes. And it's entirely possible that there are not just individual differences in implicit personality theory, but it's entirely possible that there are cultural differences as well. So if you go to North America and ask people what they think about personality, they get one set of views. If you go to Japan or China or India or wherever, Bechuana land, you would get an entirely different view of personality, because personality is embedded in people's cultural views. It's a very good hypothesis. Now, we don't know anything about that, and Ash and Wishner certainly didn't know anything about that. They're dealing with Rutgers and Penn college students, which is the culture we know best. Okay? But that's the general idea here, which is that, again, what makes a trait central is that it's related to lots of other traits. And so if you know where a person stands on a central trait, you have some sense of what he or she is like in other domains as well. Whereas peripheral traits simply don't carry those kinds, that much information. Another way of putting this is that a central trait is a trait where when you change it, you change a lot of other traits as well, again, by virtue of this relatively high correlation. You got a question?
So the numbers that follow that, like warm and cold, what exactly do those people play?
Okay, these are correlation coefficients, okay? It's a statistic that measures the strength and magnitude of the association between two variables. And just to kind of unpack this for a minute, the mean correlation between warm-cold and the other 52 traits in Wishner's list was 0.62, which is a very big correlation, okay? The mean correlation between intelligent and unintelligent and the other 52 traits in Wishner's list was 0.56, average unsigned correlation. Some of them were negative, some of them were positive, doesn't matter. And that's a big one. Now, if you're watching this carefully, okay, the mean correlation for so-called peripheral traits was lower, but it's still a pretty good correlation. To be honest with you, in social science research, you would kill for a correlation of 0.43 between one variable and another. So, with all due respect to Wishner, this isn't completely compelling, but the pattern is interesting, and it shows us, I think, that Wishner was onto something. In fact, Seymour Rosenberg, a personality psychologist at Rutgers University, looked at this, thought Wishner had the right idea, maybe not quite, not exactly right. Rosenberg had more computational power available to him in the late 60s and early 70s than Wishner had in the late 50s and early 60s, and he began to look at this problem over again. What Rosenberg did was to employ a variant on the correlation coefficient known as factor analysis. You don't have to know the details of factor analysis. If you want to know the details of factor analysis, there's some information on that in the lecture supplements. But basically, what factor analysis does is a technique for extracting the basic dimensions that underlie a whole matrix of intercorrelations. Okay? So what Rosenberg did was to look at a very large matrix of intercorrelations among traits, and he discovered that some of these would cluster together into higher order factors, and then some of these higher order factors would cluster together into super higher order factors, suggesting that there's actually a hierarchical structure in personality trait ratings where at the bottom you got these primary traits like maybe warm and cold and intelligent and unintelligent, and at the next higher level you've got some other set of traits and so on. What Rosenberg in fact argued was that there are two huge super factors that run through everybody's ratings of people's personality traits, whether they're rating other people's personality traits or their own personality traits, and these two huge super factors are what Rosenberg called social good-bad and intellectual good-bad. Here's what Rosenberg's structure looks like. This is actually from an earlier study. Here you have a whole bunch of traits, and what you got here are two major dimensions: good versus bad socially, nice people versus bad people, okay? And good versus bad intellectually, smart people versus stupid people. And what you've got here is the distance between each of these traits and the vector here basically represents the association between the trait and that super factor. So that traits like unhappy, vain, finicky, irritable, and moody, which lie very close to the good-bad vector, are very highly correlated with social good versus bad. Traits like clumsy, frivolous, foolish, and naive, which lie very close to the intellectual good-bad factor, are very highly correlated with that factor. They load highly on it in the language of factor analysis. And what you can see here is that the two trait dimensions that Ash identified as central lie very close to these factors. Here's unintelligent. That's not my misspelling. That's Rosenberg's. Okay. and there's intelligent, very, very, very close to the intellectual good-bad factor. And here's cold, and here's warm, not quite so close, but still pretty good. Okay, you get the idea about what this is like. The idea here about in Rosenberg's reanalysis is not just that what makes a trait central is that it correlates highly with other traits. What makes a trait central is that by virtue of its high correlation with lots of other traits, central traits load highly on these super factors that run through trait ratings of personality. So those two big super factors are intellectual and social good-bad. Warm and cold is a central trait because it's very, very, very closely related to social good-bad. Intelligent versus unintelligent is a central trait because it lies very close in this scheme to the factor that defines intellectual good and bad. Now, if you look, you won't find polite and blunt on here. Rosenberg didn't actually look at that one, but the implication is that if we could locate polite and blunt in this matrix someplace, it'd be way off, okay? It wouldn't lie close to either of these factors. That's because in Rosenberg's reanalysis, it's by virtue of loading highly on one or the other of these two big factors in personality that central traits carry more information than peripheral traits. Central traits simply have more implications for unobserved features of personality. Now, it turns out that there's a problem of, I don't want to go into this right now, it just is too complicated for the time we've got, but it turns out that context that matters to this a lot. Ash did an experiment which he just couldn't understand really at all, in which he put warm, cold, or intelligent, unintelligent into an ensemble, a stimulus ensemble of lists of traits, and then asked people to rate, show their impressions of personality on an entirely new list of traits. And it turned out that in that particular experiment, warm, cold, and intelligent, unintelligent didn't prove to be central. Now that's weird, okay, because the whole point of a central trait is that it's central to impression formation. And the reason it didn't prove central in that particular experiment was that the particular traits that Ash used to collect his impressions didn't have anything to do with friendliness versus unfriendliness or intelligence versus unintelligence. So you can find traits where where central trait just doesn't have any implications, and then it's no longer central. Context matters, but we don't have to deal with that right now. Okay, now, what's the real implication of this? If I tell you that somebody's warm as opposed to cold, and then you say to yourself, knowing that this individual is warm as opposed to cold, I now know a whole bunch of other things about this person. I have some idea about what to expect because Killstrom's given me information about where this person lies on a central trait. The fact that you can make inferences from knowing that a person is warm or cold to a whole host of other attributes about the person means that you have to carry something like the correlation matrix around in your head. You have to carry around in your head some sense of what goes with what in the domain of personality. Because if you didn't have that, warm versus cold wouldn't be informative, okay? Because all the stimulus simply is this person is warm or cold. But in order to perceive that stimulus, in order to make sense of that stimulus, you bring to the act of perception pre-existing knowledge about the world. In this case, pre-existing knowledge about the social world. That pre-existing knowledge is what we mean when we talk about this concept of implicit personality theory, a concept that, again, was originally introduced by Bruner and Tajuri in this great 1954 paper. Yeah? Yeah, these days we might call it a schema, okay? Because a schema is an organized knowledge structure that's pertinent to some domain. You have an automobile schema, some sense. If I say, let's go for a drive in my car, you have some sense of what we're going to do, okay? You have a wedding schema. If your girlfriend says, I've been invited to a wedding next Saturday, will you go with me? You have some sense of what it's going to be about. If your roommate says, you want to go out with my sister on Friday night, she's really intelligent, you have some sense of what she's going to be like, right? That's because you had these schemata, okay? Plural of schemas, plural of schema, okay? Implicit personality theory is kind of like a schema for personality. It's your pre-existing sense of what personality is like. Now, Bruner and Tajuri say, well, it's not just a schema, okay? It's really a lot bigger than that, but it's the same idea. A pre-existing organized cognitive structure that provides a framework for perception and memory. And what Bruner and Tajuri argued was that we carry around in our heads a pre-existing cognitive structure, a pre-existing cognitive representation of what personality is like, that we use as a framework for forming impressions of personality and helping us remember things about personality. So what do we mean by implicit? Okay, it's implicit because it's, in Bruner's sense, naive. Most people are not professional personality psychologists, okay? You're not trained in experimental design. You're not trained in the methods of personality assessment. Most of you didn't even know what a correlation coefficient was before we started this lecture today. So you're not professionals, but despite the fact that we're not professionals, all of us develop in the course of everyday living some sense of what personality is like, some sense of what goes with what, some sense of what kinds of people there are out in the world. It may be right, it may be wrong, it may be accurate in some respects, it may be biased and inaccurate in other kinds of respects, but there are our own individual theories of personality that we use as a framework for social perception and social interaction. Question? It doesn't necessarily imply that, okay? It's entirely, we're going to talk about automaticity later in the course, okay? So so hold that thought. It's entirely possible that if I say to you, you want to go out with my sister Friday night, she's a very warm, intelligent kind of person, you sit there and say, okay, now before I say yes or no, let's really think hard about what that means. You know, if she's warm, you kind of do this mental checklist of all the features of personality in a very conscious, deliberate way. Or it might be that somehow we're so practiced with dealing with concepts of warmth and intelligence and all of that, that the whole image of what this woman is like comes to mind, okay, automatically. They were silent about this, okay? But as we'll see later on in the course, we're going to return to this concept time after time after time, because it's very, very, very important. What you'll see is that there are people who make an argument that a lot of social cognition occurs automatically, unconsciously, without much effort. I think those claims are grossly exaggerated. There's something to this automaticity argument. Anybody who's ever walked down the hall and had somebody say, hi, how are you? And say, fine, how are you? Even when you're feeling terrible and you'd rather be dead, okay? Knows that there's something to the automaticity of social behavior. But they didn't really take a position on this at all. What Bruner and Tajuri argued was that through our experience in the world, through our experience of dealing with people, learning about people, being taught about people in various kinds of ways, we build up in our heads a set of what's essentially a naive, that is, unschooled, implicit, that is, not necessarily thought about explicitly, theory of personality and what people are like that has information in it like the relations among various kinds of traits. Okay, so that's what implicit personality theory is. Lee Cronbach, who's a very important figure in personality psychology, the Bruner just kind of tossed this off in a way that he does. I mean, just an idle thought from Jerome Bruner is something that somebody else would turn into something very, very profound. The guy's brilliant. But Lee Cronbach said, well, okay, what exactly would we mean by an implicit personality theory? And he said, well, let's look at formal theories of personality and use that as a model for what people carry around in their heads. So he said, first, we can think about implicit personality theory as what Cronbach called the judge's description of the generalized other, the image, the representation that we carry around in our heads about what people are like in general. That's the generalized other. Not what you're like as an individual or what you're like as an individual, but kind of what people are like in general. That's it. So first, we have in our heads some sense of what the important dimensions of personality are. Rosenberg argued that the important dimensions of personality are something like social good versus bad and intellectual good versus bad. Those are the dimensions that are important to us. Second, we carry around in our heads estimates of the mean values of the population on these dimensions. Do you think most people are smart or most people are stupid? Do you think most people are nice or bad? Warm or cold? That's what we mean by estimates of mean values. We don't mean that everybody carries around the idea that the average person scores 7.389 points on a 10-point scale of intelligence. What we mean is just kind of some sense of where the central tendency of the population is. Not just the central tendency, but also the variance in the population. Cronbach argued that we carry that around as well. So what's the spread around intelligence? Okay, there are individual differences in intelligence, but do you think that most people are smart or smart enough and only a few people are stupid? Or do you think that there's a whole lot of stupid people out there, right? That's some sense of the variance of the population. Estimates of covariances. Covariance is a technical term that for our purposes really refers to correlation, okay? So Cronbach argued that we carry around in our heads some sense of what goes with what the correlation between warmth versus cold and other things, intelligence versus unintelligence or other things. We also, Cronbach also argued, this gets back to your the question, first, that there are individual differences in implicit personality theory. One person might think that most people are nice and smart. Another person might think that most people are kind of stupid and that makes them saps, so that makes them look nice, but the important thing is that they're really stupid. Another person might think that most people are evil geniuses. You know? Whatever it is, those individuals are going to have interesting interactions, but those interactions are going to be caused by their individual differences in implicit personality theory. If you meet up with somebody who has an entirely different view of the social world than you do, you're going to have an interesting interaction, okay? And then finally, this gets directly to your point, Cronbach suggested that there might be cultural differences. He didn't think necessarily about, you know, Westerners versus Easterners or anything like that. He just thought, look, you know, culture, after all, is defined by anthropologists as patterns of knowledge and behavior that are transmitted through human institutions from one generation to the next. That's the definition of culture. Okay, so one of the patterns of knowledge that's transmitted from one generation to the next might be knowledge about personality. So yeah, different cultures might be characterized by different theories, the implicit theories of personality. Nancy Cantor and I added into this a little bit, and we argued that there are some other things that go along with implicit theories of personality. For example, people carry around in their heads basic assumptions about human nature, okay, about what makes us different from other animals and so on. Assumptions about the causes of behavior in general. To put it bluntly, most of our behavior due to situational pressures, or is most of our behavior due to internal personal desires, the origins of individual differences. Some of us think that we all recognize individual differences in personality. Some of us think those are genetic in origin. Others of us think those are environmental in origin. That's part of your implicit theory of personality too. And then we line up with Cronbach, in terms of thinking about, well, what are the fundamental the personality traits? What are the fundamental dimensions of personality, the dimensions that really make a difference for social behavior and for social perception? Where do people tend to stand on these traits? What's the shape of the distribution, and so on. So again, implicit theory of personality refers to the theory, the framework, the cognitive framework that we carry around in our heads that represents our own individual knowledge or beliefs about what people are like. This implicit theory of personality, then, is the cognitive contribution to perception. It doesn't come from the stimulus. It comes from you. It comes from the perceiver. It's the contribution of the perceiver to the act of perception. Here's another example of an implicit theory of personality that is very widely shared. I referred to this briefly last time. Thurstone's notion of the halo effect. The average person has the idea that socially desirable traits tend to be correlated with each other. That good things go together, okay? Socially desirable personality traits are positively intercorrelated. They're not randomly associated. And in fact, we have the idea that there's a positive correlation between social and intellectual evaluation as well. Something about this I'll point out. When you represent correlations graphically like this, the correlations between vectors are represented by the angular distance between them. So if two traits are completely unrelated to each other, the vectors representing those traits meet at a right angle, okay? To the extent that two traits are correlated with each other, the vectors meet at an acute angle. These are pretty acute angles. It's roughly a 45-degree angle. And again, these are people's impressions of personality. People have the idea that social good-bad is at least to some extent correlated with intellectual good-bad. We have the sense, most of us, not everybody, but there's a general sense that if you're smart, you're also nice. Now, everybody can think of exceptions to this, right? Okay. But not only that, there's also the halo effect also extends to physical characteristics. I'll show you later. I think I'll show you later if I get to that. That we also think that good-looking people are A, smart, and good-looking people are B, nice. Okay. So again, socially desirable traits tend to correlate together. Maybe not in the real world, but in our beliefs about people, in our naive, intuitive, implicit theories of personality. Let's focus a little bit more on this a question of individual differences for a moment, okay? Here's one possible implicit theory of personality pertaining to the distribution in the population of intellectual and social desirability. This is a theory. A person might say, well, smartness and niceness are distributed according to a bell curve. Not too many people really smart, not too many people really nice, not too many people really stupid, not too many people really bad, okay? Most people falling somewhere in between. That would be one person's implicit theory of personality. Or we could have the implicit theory of personality represented by what's known in psychology as the Pollyanna principle. Those of you who read the story of Pollyanna as children know that Pollyanna was kind of a mythical character who thought that everybody was nice, and all's for the best in this best of all possible worlds kind of person. So for somebody following the Pollyanna principle, the distribution of intellectual and social good and bad gets shifted up. So that, yeah, we recognize individual differences, but even the bad people aren't so bad. And even the stupid people aren't so stupid. Okay, so kind of put a nice light on things. Or you could say, well, look, my theory is that goodness is distributed bimodally. Most people are pretty smart. Most people are pretty nice. But there are some people down here, right, who are just not nice and just really not very smart at all. If you believe that the world looks like this socially, you're going to behave differently than if you than if you abide by the Pollyanna principle or whatever. So again, these are just illustrations of how different theories of different implicit theories of personality could be represented graphically. Okay, skipping over this. So what is our implicit personality theory? What is the general theory, implicit theory of personality held by the population at large? In the history of the study of social cognition, there have basically been three different models that have played a major role. The first one known as the semantic differential model, the second an evaluation model, and the third, which I'll talk about right at the end, known as the Big Five model of implicit personality theory. First, the semantic differential model, which comes to us from Charles Osgood, who was a pioneering cognitive psychologist who was mostly interested in language semantics, in aspects of meaning. Osgood, long ago, back in 1954 was a great year for psychology, right? That was really a good year. Osgood promoted a very, very, very influential affective theory of meaning, which basically argued that you could plot differences in the meanings ascribed to different kinds of objects, connotative meaning, affective meaning, in a three-dimensional space. One dimension defined by evaluation, whether something was good or bad. Another dimension defined by potency, whether something is strong or weak. And another dimension defined by activity, whether something is active or passive. And Osgood argued that you could actually plot the meaning of any term in any language in this three-dimensional space. And he did these really interesting experiments in which he'd give people an adjective checklist with adjectives like good, bad, strong, weak, active, and passive. And then he'd hold up a picture of a dog, or a cat, or an automobile, or a steamship, or whatever, and have people plot, check off the characteristics that came to mind when they contemplated that object. And the idea was that differences in meaning were represented by the meaning of an object could be represented by the location of that object in this three-dimensional space, and differences in meaning could be represented by the distances between 2 points in this three-dimensional space. And again, he did this with all sorts of objects, abstract concepts. You can think about war as bad and strong and active. You can think about peace as good and weak and passive. Not necessarily, but you could think about that. That just kind of gives you the difference of what the difference is between war and peace. That was the logic that Osgood applied. And basically, this three-dimensional space, these three dimensions of evaluation, potency, and activity came to be regarded as a pretty interesting model for implicit personality theory. The idea that what we do is we carry around in our heads and we form impressions of people based on things like evaluation, potency, and activity. Is the person good or bad? Is the person strong or weak? Is the person active and passive? These three dimensions, it was argued, are what our implicit theories of personality are based on, and these three dimensions are the three dimensions in which we tend to perceive other people. Yeah? Yes. That's been done. That will take us very far afield. I'm going to try to do that again. This is a kind of wonderful question you should post to the forum so I can talk about it for about half an hour. Nancy Cantor, who is my collaborator in some of this work, did work very much like that. And then roughly the same time, David Buss, who was a graduate student here, is now at the University of Texas, did something very similar. Going to talk about this a little bit later on when we talk about the behavioral correlates of personality traits. So hang on to that thought. But if you want to put it up on the forum, you'll get an answer even more quickly. Okay, so that's the semantic differential model. The alternative for a long time was an evaluation model proposed by Seymour Rosenberg, I've just introduced him, who basically said, there's only one dimension in person perception. There's only one dimension that we use to form our impressions of other people, and that is the dimension of evaluation, okay? It turns out evaluation and potency, he argued, are highly correlated. We tend to think that good things are strong, bad things are weak, and the activity dimension he thought was just very weak to begin with. He said, look, okay, there are two different kinds of evaluation, intellectual evaluation and social evaluation, but as I indicated before, they tend to be kind of related to each other. So counterposed to Osgood's three-factor theory of implicit personality theory, evaluation, potency, and activity, Rosenberg postulated that there's really just a single factor of evaluation. Well, how would you go about testing this? Well, here's what Rosenberg and his colleagues did. He took a bunch of people, like yourselves, like ourselves, and he had them, depending on the experiment, he had them simply describe what they were like as people or what their acquaintances were like as people. Some of these descriptions were provided in the form of free descriptions, little narratives where you're given a blank piece of paper and you just have to write stuff down. Others were collected in the form of adjective checklists where you give somebody a representative list of trait adjectives and you have them check off which adjectives apply. Each subject described himself and 35 other people in exactly the same way. The free descriptions were coded, the adjective checklists were entered into a computer, and then Rosenberg analyzed this data at the level of the individual subject using a variant on factor analysis known as multidimensional scaling. And again, you don't have to know anything about the techniques of multidimensional scaling, except that what multidimensional scaling basically does is analyze similarity data to reveal the basic dimensions underlying people's similarity judgments. That's what it does. To make a long story short, what Rosenberg found was that individual people, he had dozens and hundreds of subjects doing this. He had a huge computer and he had it all to himself, and he's kind of running through all this stuff. And he found out that in fact, most people's descriptions of other people's personalities could be accounted for by a single dimension of evaluation. Osgood's three-dimensional structure with potency and activity joining evaluation was very rare. Most people's personality descriptors didn't require three dimensions to account for all the variance. You could account for most of the variance with just a single factor of evaluation, which turned out everywhere. Everybody's strongest factor, the strongest dimension of evaluation turns out to be this evaluation factor. So basically, that's this was how he tested one model of implicit personality theory, which says that we have in our heads a three-dimensional structure that looks at evaluation, potency, and activity against a one-dimension theory that says we just look at evaluation. Now, it's very clear that we look at evaluation, okay? But it's not at all clear that our implicit theories of personality are as monolithic as that. More recently, yet a third candidate for implicit theories of personality has been proposed in the form of the so-called five-factor model of personality. If you took an introductory psychology course, if you took a personality psychology course, you know what the five-factor model is. Basically, it says that there are five major dimensions in personality: neuroticism, extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness to experience. These five dimensions are revealed time after time after time whenever anybody subjects a set of trait ratings to multivariate procedures like factor analysis and multidimensional scaling, leading some personality psychologists to postulate that this five-factor model is a universally applicable structure of personality. That is, it's encoded in language, and you'll see how that is done in a minute. It's applicable across cultures. You can use the same five dimensions in theory. You can use the same five dimensions to identify individual differences among Japanese, as Americans, as Germans, as Chileans, as anything. You know, you could just apply it to anything. Sam Gosling at the University of Texas actually applied the five-factor model to dogs. You know, there are some species that are high on extroversion and low on neuroticism and really friendly, dogs. And then there are those dogs that are just really neurotic as hell. So you can even do it with dogs, okay? Valid across cultures, valid across generations. It works for kids, it works for adults, it works for old people. Valid across epochs, it works for the 19th century, it works for the 20th century. A universally applicable theory of personality. And the suggestion is, here's the way it goes, okay? So what do we mean by extroversion? Well, talkative versus silent, frank versus secretive. What do we mean by agreeableness? Good-natured, gentle, cooperative. You got the idea? Conscientiousness, tidy, scrupulous, persevering. Emotional stability or neuroticism, nervous, anxious, excitable. And then openness, artistically sensitive, intellectual, refined, and imaginative. The idea here is that these are the fundamental dimensions of individual differences in personality. And this then becomes absorbed into the idea that we carry this structure around in our heads. That these are the five dimensions in which we perceive other people's personalities. These are the five dimensions that we use to form impressions of what other people are like. This is an alternative candidate for implicit personality theory, that what we have in our heads, okay, is what I like to call the big five blind date questions. The five things that you would want to know about somebody you're going to have to spend some serious time with, okay? Is she outgoing? Is she crazy? Is she friendly? Is she reliable? Or is she interesting? What else do you want to know about a person? Really, not much else do you want to know about a person. Okay, some of you want to know whether she's good looking or not. Philistines, okay? But psychologically, this is what you want to know about a person, and there's very little else you want to know. The intuitive appeal of the big five structure of personality is so strong that it's a very likely candidate for what our implicit theories of personality are like. Evaluation, potency, and activity, no, probably doesn't work. Evaluation, too monolithic, not differentiated enough. Here you've got kind of the Goldilocks structure. It's just right. Five dimensions, not too many, not too few, and just right for capturing the gist of what a person's personality is. Here's where we think implicit personality theory is focused, the cognitive framework that we use for judging other people's personalities and forming impressions of other people. Thanks very much. Have a good weekend. We'll see